and we'll do a little countdown. I like doing the Spanish flea. I think it was from the dating game. Do 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 do. What will the Quandre Diggs trade mean for your IDP team? That and more this week on the IDP Roundtable. Guru, we saw a trade. A lot of Lions players not excited about it because it was their captain, Quandre Diggs. But this has been a team that's had 3 viable safeties. Maybe Diggs was the least viable. It's going to create a trade ripple for our teams, our IDP teams. What do you see in terms of impact?
Well, I don't know that he was necessarily the least viable for the Lions, but he was probably had the most value as far as trade bait. So that's kind of the guy you get rid of if you've got some other guys that you think can get the job done. So we'll start with going to Seattle. What does he do for that situation? I think there's a couple of questions we need to get answered there. Number one, did they trade for Diggs to replace Thompson? Or did they trade for Diggs because they're afraid that McDougal's injury is going to linger a little bit? From what we heard from Pete Carroll at the podium after the last week's games, McDougal's expected to be back at practice this week and be able to play this week. So on at least the surface, it seems like that's probably not the case there. So maybe Tedrick Thompson is the one that's likely to be out of a job here. But either way, Diggs is going to get on the field. He's going to wind up starting for somebody. Probably going to put up some pretty decent numbers as the safeties in Seattle tend to do so, especially McDougal at the strong safety position when he is healthy. I don't know that he's going to be great numbers, so definitely somebody you want to think about adding if he's available in your league. Chances are he's not, as he put up decent numbers with Detroit as well. As far as McDougal or Thompson, if those are guys that you're rostering or have been playing, I think we set both of those guys until we see exactly how this plays out, what the effect is there. Go back to Detroit. They have 2 viable options to move into the starting lineup. Tavon Wilson is a known commodity. It's a guy that's put up pretty decent numbers for us in the past when given an opportunity. Solid yet unspectacular as a strong safety option. Gets the job done. Not great in the big play department. Solid tackler. Good quality veteran option. Then they have rookie 3rd-round pick Will Harris, who played a little more this past week than Wilson did as the 3rd safety. He had a few extra snaps, which was the first time that had happened this year. So I'm really wondering, since they know what they have in Wilson and they know they don't have necessarily a great player, but they do have a quality one there, maybe they're going to throw the rookie in there. And I mean, it's hard to say. We haven't really seen enough of him to know what to expect from him. But those are their 2 options. Providing one of those guys gets all of the opportunity, there's a good opportunity there, a good chance that whoever gets that job is going to have some decent value for us going forward. It's a position that traditionally puts up pretty good tackle numbers and has an opportunity for big plays in that particular defensive scheme.
As Wes Booth showed us, more attractive as he labeled as a cornerback. I can remember using Quandre Diggs as a cornerback. Matt, I'm going to toss it to you. Feel free to weigh in on the trade, and then also talk about another winds of change at the safety position. John Johnson, who's been excellent for our fantasy teams, going on injured reserve.
Yeah, I want to say just real quick in Detroit, if there were any other matchup pretty much for them this week, I would say let's wait and see what happens before we use anybody. But the fact that they're playing the Giants this week might make Tavon Wilson worth using. I would love if we could get word for sure on who plays, who starts there before the game. But my guess would be Tavon Wilson. He's had a couple of previous starts this year. He played 74%, 94% in one game earlier this season. Week 4 against Kansas City, had 10 tackles there. So again, the fact that they're playing the Giants makes Tavon Wilson worth a look in certain places. But yeah, moving over to the Rams situation. So John Johnson hit IR last week with a shoulder injury, and we're wondering who's going to replace him. Sean McVay said before we got the final diagnosis on Johnson's injury and before he got placed on IR that if he was out, if he missed time, Marquis Christian would step into his starting role. We did see Marquis Christian play. He played 80% of the snaps in that game against Atlanta, but Taylor Rapp was the one who got the most playing time. He actually led all Rams defenders at 98% of the snaps against the Falcons. As I believe John said, watch for Taylor Rapp to get more playing time coming up. So it happened. Taylor Rapp had played less than 50% in 3 of his 5 games before the Atlanta matchup. He had not topped 76%. There he was at 98% against the Falcons. Again, led everybody, but Marquis Christian was also playing at starter level, played 80% in that game. And I think that what we're probably going to get is more of these 3 safeties, because Troy Reeder started at inside linebacker again next to Corey Littleton. It was his 3rd straight start, but Troy Reeder only played 35% of the snaps in this game. 2nd straight dip. He went from 73% in his first start to 61% playing time, down to 35%. Those snaps did not go to another linebacker. Kenny Young, for example, did not play at all after arriving in the trade for Marcus Peters. And there just wasn't anybody playing a prominent role at the position. So I think what we're going to see is more of these 3 safeties, where Eric Weddle's playing all the time, Taylor Rapp looks like he's going to play all the time, and Marquis Christian looks like he'll play pretty much all the time. Both Rapp and Christian are capable of playing, slot coverage. They're capable of playing up in the box. Eric Weddle can do whatever you ask him to. So I would imagine that the Rams will view this as their best path going forward, rather than playing somebody in a large role in the inside linebacker spot next to Corey Littleton.
And one other note, going back to Tavon Wilson, of course, he's got that history with Matt Patricia. So maybe there's some trust there. Of course, we always trust in the guru. Another trade to look at, John. Garyon Conley doesn't look very good versus Green Bay and gets shipped out. Will that give us a new rookie corner to target?
It very well might. I think one of the interesting things about this trade, I'm sure somewhere along the line has happened in NFL history before, where a player plays against a team 1 week and then the following week plays for the team he played the previous week against his old team. So Conley goes from Oakland to Houston. Houston plays Oakland this week, so that'll be he won't have to wait very long for that revenge game, like some people have to circle it on their calendar. So he'll get a pretty quick opportunity. Conley's a guy that has had his ups and downs for a high round draft pick as he was, hasn't really ever lived up to those expectations. Houston's got a bunch of serious injury issues. They're hurting with their top 2 guys out. So Conley comes in immediately, becomes a starter for them, kind of gives them some security at that position, and he may work out better in that defense than what he has for the Raiders so far. But I think where the fantasy impact might come in here is that by moving him out, the Raiders have an opportunity to put 2nd round pick Tavon Mullen into the starting lineup. And we all know the rookie corner rule. When you get a rookie that's in a starting position, offenses will tend to target that player, try to pick on their inexperience, force them into mistakes. So they wind up with an exaggerated number of opportunities because the offense is targeting them as a weakness. So going forward here, we're keeping an eye on Mullen. Raiders corners are traditionally not some of our most productive fantasy options, but when you get a rookie starting in there, there might be a little more to look at.
And another note really quickly on that is that some hope that because Conley will be going to a scheme where he plays more man in Houston, that will get us more of his value. It wasn't a great zone corner. Matt, the Eagles could use corners who can play man, zone, whatever, corners who can play. After watching them against the Cowboys, there's some problems, especially with the back 7. How do we sift through that to help our IDP teams?
Yeah, I like how Oakland, by the way, wanted to get a look at the young guys at corner, so they shipped off the old man who was 24.
Yeah.
So the Philly back 7, we had no Nigel Bradham last week. They, of course, dumped Zach Brown after the Minnesota game. So Nathan Jerry played every snap at linebacker for them against Dallas. We'll start in front of the secondary. And he introduced himself as Nathan Jerry, so I have to stop calling him Nate Gary, I guess, when I'm talking about him. Led the Eagles with 11 tackles, 7 solos against the Cowboys. If Bradham's out, it looks like Nathan Jerry is a starting option for us. Camu Grugier-Hill, who sounds like a boarding school, played 84% of the snaps in that game against Dallas, managed only 4 tackles, 2 solos, so he is not really an option until he shows otherwise to me. And, we'll see when Nigel Bradham is ready to play again. TJ Edwards picked up just 21% of the snaps. Duke Riley played 4 snaps. So it's really just the 2 linebackers for the Eagles there. In the secondary, we did get Jalen Mills back. He played for the first time since his foot injury last October. Missed all summer, was inactive for the beginning of this season, just returned and played 63 of 69 snaps for that game. So 91%, I believe, on that. Full playing time right away, tied for the lead among Philly corners in playing time, and gave us worthwhile fantasy numbers there. Jalen Mills at times has been a strong fantasy contributor. He's one of those guys who's just good enough to stay on the field and just bad enough that he gets targeted a lot, playing for an Eagles team that generally scores enough points to pressure opponents into throwing some. So Jalen Mills is at the very least a good guy to get in lineups for positive matchups where you get opponents that are throwing a lot. You get opponents that we expect to be trailing Philly and throwing to catch up. He's been about a DB4 level producer over the past couple of years. So that's in, the range where you consider the matchups and think about him as a possible starting option. Last season, before he went down in the middle of the year, Jalen Mills gave us 2+ pass breakups in 4 different games among the 8 that he played. And then it looks like this week the Eagles might finally get Ronald Darby back. He missed the past 4 games with a hamstring injury, was on the injury report last week, did not play in that game, is not on the injury report as of Wednesday. I checked this afternoon. We'll see if anything changes, but if he's not on it at all for Wednesday, no injury status, that says to me that Darby's going to be ready to play. I would assume we'll get a full game from him. He's certainly going to be risky until he gets a full game in. And it's not a great matchup against Buffalo, but Ronald Darby is starter worthy most of the time in cornerback slots when he's healthy.
Your description there, just good enough to stay on the field, but bad enough to get targeted a lot. As a Steelers fan, Matt, I think of William Gay. That's who pops into mind. Sorry if William Gay is watching right now. John, we got a lot of linebacker notes around the league, including if you want to weigh in on that Eagles playing time. But we've got some notes. We were going to visit again with A.J. Johnson, an update on Deion Buchanan, and more on the LB beat.
Yeah, I got a little bit to donate on the Jalen Mills thing. For Sig and I play in a lot of leagues that are corner required, so you have to have those guys starting on the outside out there. And Mills has been a rather productive one. In fact, either of the starting safeties, regardless of what their name is, for the Eagles tend to put up pretty good numbers. It can be Rasul Douglas, it can be Darby, it can be Mills. The problem with those guys is figuring out which one's going to be healthy from week to week, and it's been that way for the last 2 years. In fact, I lost to Sig this week because I had Ronald Darby in my lineup, and he was active for that game. I had Mills out of my lineup because he hasn't played since last October, so surely they're not going to give him a full workload. Darby doesn't step on the field. Mills has 4 tackles, 4 assists, and a turnover, so I lose by 20 points, and he scored a little over 20 points. So that's how the ball rolls. But anyway, yeah, so if you're in corner required leagues, these guys are definitely going to give you some opportunity if you can grab Mills or Darby and play them for whatever time you can get out of them before their next hangnail, get them in the end of your game. Linebackers, few things we can update here. One thing I'm a little concerned about is Quan Smith losing some snaps. We've seen his snap count go down pretty steadily. Week 3 played 92%. Week 4 was the week that he was off with the personal issues, 89% week 6, 69% this past week. And I'm not really sure what the issue is there, what's going on. I mean, we saw everybody else play their normal workload, even though it was somewhat of a blowout. So I'm not real sure if there's an issue there with Quan Smith or something. But if this is a guy, he put up plenty of good numbers for the 69% of the snaps that he did play. There was no issue with his production. But this is a situation that if this is a guy you're counting on every week, you probably want to keep a close eye on that and just to see if you can figure out what might be going on there. Jaguars had a couple injury situations. We've talked about in the past, we saw Najee Good step in and replace Quincy Williams a couple weeks ago. Good lasted until about the first quarter this past week. Foot injury, he's done. They bring in Quincy Williams. He plays most of the game, then injures his hamstring late in the game. They're really paper thin there, so they go out and sign Malcolm Smith off the street. It's kind of an interesting signing to me because Smith is a guy who has in the past put up pretty good numbers. He had 2 really good years with Oakland in 2015 and 16, I believe it was, where he was a very solid player, 80-some tackles, put up some big play numbers as well. And then he was injured during some time when he went to San Francisco, never quite managed to come back from that injury. And then they go ahead and draft Fred Warner and so forth, and Smith becomes expendable and they cut him. This is another one of those situations. If you're in a league that you really need to beat your competition to the punch, this is a guy you might want to try to slide onto your roster and get a look at him this week. But they are pretty much down to bare minimum on options, so I really don't see where they're going to have any option but to at least get him on the field some. And he has been a 3-down linebacker for quite a few, well, I'd say quite a few, but for a couple of years, especially in Oakland, he was 3 downs. And there could be some good opportunity there to pick up somebody that can make some hay for you. A.J. Johnson this past week, after 2 strong weeks, 2 tackles, 1 assist, lost some playing time. When I went back and watched the film on this, he was in all the base packages. He was in most of your nickel packages. He was out in dime packages, and he was out in short yardage packages. Maybe late in the game, he might have missed a few snaps for some other reason, but for most part of the game, I know through at least the first 3 quarters, he was in somewhat of a regular role. Ended up with right around 70% of the playing time. So it's definitely something that makes you a little nervous about starting him next week. I would definitely keep an eye on that going forward. But so far, I've not seen anything that makes me think it's time to dump him back into the pool and move on. I still think he's going to be a pretty good option for us on most weeks. Deone Buchanan signed with the Giants this week, and we kind of thought we might have found an answer there with David Mayo. Had a good game. Next week, his numbers dropped a little bit. His playing time dropped a little bit. Last week, he was down less than 50% of the snaps. They actually had Michael Thomas, the safety, wound up playing a bunch of linebacker, like a big nickel type deal, him up near the line in a linebacker alignment. So I'm not sure how soon Buchanan gets an opportunity, if he gets an opportunity, or what's going to go on there. But as thin as they are at the position, I'd be hard pressed to believe that they're not going to give him some opportunity to play and make an impact there. One comment on the Eagles thing there. Yes, Nathan Jerry had 100% of the playing time this week. He put up the better numbers, but 1 week does not make a trend. Grugier Hill still saw plenty of opportunity in that game. It's like like we said, it's going to depend on what happens when they get everybody back healthy there. But I have a feeling that Grugier Hill is going to be the guy that winds up sticking in the near full-time role going forward. But if you picked him up, do not cut him just because he had 1 bad week. How often have we seen when there's 2 good linebackers in a situation, they kind of take turns having the better production? So my idea, and I've done it in a couple leagues, I've slid both of these guys onto my roster until I can figure out which one of them is going to have the value. If you've got room to do that, you can get your hands on them. That might be your best way to handle that situation.
Matt, I also want to hear your thoughts if you want to add anything to this Quan Smith situation. I loved him at Georgia. I thought we were looking at the next Patrick Willis type talent. What's going on there? And this is a good moment. And one of the things about hosting the IDP show that is fun is getting to talk about some underrated players or players that might not be household names except for people that follow a team closely. And Lorenzo Alexander was for a long time a special teams ace, and then occasional pass rusher, could play a Swiss Army knife. And since he's been in Buffalo, at times he was a very valuable IDP player. Fell off a little bit, but now he's back.
Yeah, so let's hit all these linebacker spots. Let me start with Alexander Johnson real quick. I like to say that the name his mama gave him because I'm not worried about him. He and Quan Smith played about the same amount this past week. I have not seen any indication that anybody is disappointed with anything that he's doing. In fact, just this week, Al Wilson, who we all remember playing linebacker for the Broncos, said that he thinks Alexander Johnson could be a Pro Bowl player. He said he will be a Pro Bowl player within the next couple of years, and that he could be even better than Al Wilson was. And before that, he produced first for 2 games and drew raves from the coaches. So I think this is just a quirky thing from an odd game where they were getting blown out. Roquan Smith, on the other hand, I'm concerned about, and I was excited about him coming into this season. I had him ranked number 2 overall in my preseason rankings. I thought we were heading into a big season from him, and he is not delivering. So I am concerned about this one. I think his playing time was cut in this game because he is playing crappy this year. The Pro Football Focus's grades have him 75th overall among 92 qualifying linebackers in overall grade. He is 71st in run defense grade. And now we've seen the Bears run defense play terribly the past 2 weeks. Let me get to the numbers that I wrote down here. So through the first 4 games, they allowed 61.5 total rushing yards per game to their opponents. The past 2 weeks, 169 to the Raiders, 151 to the Saints, and that was without Alvin Kamara, of course. Now, missing out Akeem Hicks certainly hurts. He left the Oakland game early with the elbow injury, landed on IR, missed this past week's game. So he's out of the way. That's obviously going to hurt the run defense. But they were also missing Akeem Hicks back in week 4 when they played Minnesota, and they held Minnesota to 40 yards. The other guy who was missing from the lineup that week was Quan Smith. So I think that we're probably going to start seeing a little bit less Quan Smith. Maybe it's just to the degree that he missed in week 7. In that case, he could still help us, down the list in IDP leagues. But he's going to have to rebound, show something where they can trust him again and get back up to full playing time if he's going to get anywhere close to what we hoped that he was going to be. Certainly a situation that I and everybody else in this realm will be watching. Now, to finish with the positive, Lorenzo Alexander, I mean, he's like the defensive version of Fred Jackson. And we talk about Thomas Davis being old, but Lorenzo Alexander is 36. He'll be 37 in May. He started out the season playing less than he had last year. He was down to like a third of the snaps in each game. And I thought that we were just watching a guy play a smaller role as he gets older. Then all of a sudden, they started ramping him up some. The defense seemed to start performing better. And that has continued. I mean, this past week, they were without Matt Milano because of a hamstring injury. And Maurice Alexander filled in for Milano. But on the other side, it was Lorenzo Alexander who saw a playing time boost as well, 96% of the snaps in that game against Miami. That was up from his previous high of 72%, which was the previous week. It was this 3rd straight game in which Lorenzo Alexander saw a rise in his snap share. He delivered 10 tackles for us, a quarterback hit, a pass breakup in that game against the Dolphins. Alexander has given us 4 total pressures in each of his past 2 games. So Matt Milano was still limited in Wednesday's practice with that hamstring injury. He was limited all last week, so we'll have to watch and see if Milano's going to return for this game against the Eagles. Obviously, if he returns, I think we see less playing time for Lorenzo Alexander, and that's certainly going to hurt his opportunities. But as I said, even before Milano went down, and granted, the past 2 weeks was when Milano suffered his injury and then missed, but even before that, Alexander was contributing. So in deeper leagues, Lorenzo Alexander should still be on the radar. And beyond the Eagles game this week, they've got matchups with Washington, Cleveland, Miami again, and then Denver. I think there's pass rushing upside to all 4 of those contests.
John, let's go out to the secondary. And we've got some change in Indy, maybe something settled in Arizona, one nice glass of Kool-Aid that we should pass on, and a new name in New Orleans.
Yeah, I'm going to chip in on the Lorenzo Alexander thing. My only issue with Lorenzo Alexander is he's done this in the past. He'll have a few good games, and just when you think he's going to be somebody you can count on, he'll go back to having like 15 snaps in a game, and you get nothing out of him 2 or 3 weeks in a row. I agree completely, though. When the guy's in the game and on his game, he puts up some big numbers, and especially makes a lot of sacks, makes some big plays. He'll have some huge games, but he's kind of like playing roulette with a half-loaded gun. You never know for sure what you're going to get. So the safety situation, a little bit talk about the deal, what's going on in Indianapolis. Clayton Gathers has for a long time been one of my favorite safeties. He's a big physical in the box type guy, not necessarily a great pass defender. It seems to me like they're trying to find a way to work him out of the lineup here this year. This past weekend, we've seen him early in the season. He was in a timeshare with the rookie, with Willis. Then we saw Malik Hooker get hurt, so they moved Willis over to free safety, leave Gathers on the field, both of them on the field full time. All that's all good. Well, this past week we had George Odom started at strong safety and played the first 27 snaps of the game, most of the first half. And then second half, late in the second quarter, And through the second half, Gathers comes onto the field and played the last 37 snaps, put up 4 tackles, decent numbers for the number of snaps that he had. But I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. And to make the waters even muddier, this week they get Malik Hooker back. So Hooker's likely to come back and jump right back into his every down role. So at the very least, I will expect that Gathers and Willis will go back to that timeshare that we had earlier in the season, with Gathers getting about 60 to 70% of the snaps and Willis getting 25-30% of the snaps, and just enough to keep both of them from having much fantasy value. At this point, I would not be all that shocked to see them put Willis in as a starter and put Gathers pretty much on the bench or a much reduced role going forward. Just not sure what to expect out of that. The best advice I can give you for this week is to avoid everybody in this situation until we see how all this works out. The Arizona situation we've been watching between Deontay Thompson and Jalen Thompson was pretty much even in snap playing time for the first couple weeks. The production still hasn't really ramped up for either of these guys, but we did see Deontay Thompson with 90% of the playing time this week. Jalen dropped down to the 10%. So whether or not the production and box score production and fantasy value follows that is yet to be seen, but it seems like maybe they have made a decision on who they're going to get most of the playing time to. Justin Simmons had a big game this week against Kansas City. If they got to play Kansas City every week and he could basically mirror Travis Kelce, he would probably have a big game every week. I'm seeing a lot of people make moves to pick him up after this big game. And this is a guy that will, kind of like Lorenzo Alexander, he'll have put together a couple games here and there, have a big game, and then he'll vanish for a couple games. And just not somebody that you can trust every week in your lineup. He's very much a matchup-based play. If you get a situation where he's going against a great tight end, somebody that they're going to be targeting a lot, you can put him in the game because they've already shown us that they're going to use him to match up on tight ends. That's a good thing. He does well at that. He's got that skill set where he can stick with those guys. But then my favorite example of him was last year's Super Bowl in one of the leagues that I'm in. My opponent had him and needed 3 points out of him on Monday Night Football, and I won that game. So, he's just not somebody you want to count on every week. New Orleans, we saw Chauncey Gardner-Johnson have a big game this week, 7 solo tackles and 2 passes defended. That is directly related to P.J. Williams' suspension. P.J. Williams had been working in a lot of the nickel roles, a lot of the nickel situations as the third corner. With him out of there, Gardner-Johnson wound up filling in all of those spots, and they played pretty much a base nickel defense this week. So Gardner logged 91% of the snaps. Really not a surprise that with that amount of playing time that he put up good numbers. He's a player that's very capable of that, somebody that I was high on back during the preseason and so forth. If he got an opportunity to play enough, I had no doubt that he would put up those kind of numbers. He's going to get that opportunity again this week. Williams is suspended through this week, and then Williams returns. So if you're looking for somebody for a 1 week plug-in, he might be somebody that's an option for you. He's definitely, if you're in dynasty leagues, definitely somebody you want to keep an eye on going forward. Be a good guy to slide onto your taxi squad for safekeeping for a year or two until he winds up getting in a much bigger role.
Yeah, and since John's just stealing from all my notes, let me just throw in that maybe Gardner-Johnson could play his way into a bigger role, because P.J. Williams has not been that good so far. And the past 2 games, Gardner-Johnson has been the 5th highest graded defender according to Pro Football Focus among all Saints defenders, and the 4th highest graded guy the week before that. So playing well when he gets the opportunity.
Yeah, and the Saints moved up to get him in the 4th round, I think. He was one of the best day 2 players available, and he has that safety cornerback versatility. Since I'm on the subject of the draft, Matt, let's go back to the 1st round of the draft. It was in Nashville, and those Titans fans waited for a 1st round pick who tore his ACL like months before the draft and was not going to be ready for the beginning of the season, but he was ready for week 7. And was he ready? And I know you may also have something to weigh in. I just want to say the Thompson twins again, because you coined that. I love it. But tell us about the big splash debut of Jeffery Simmons.
Yeah, so I mean, when your team drafts a guy coming off an ACL, that's when you see the fan reaction where you do the upside down smile, and then you're like, yeah, and give a little clap. Yeah, the future. We're building for the future. Well, I mean, Jeffery Simmons suffered the ACL tear back in February. He's already back, so that's a pretty good recovery for him. Played 33% of the snaps in his first game back and did well with it. Sack, 4 tackles, 3 total pressures. So he's worth a look, especially because he plays defensive tackle, likely has defensive tackle eligibility in places. That's going to help his value. And because his second game is an upside matchup with the Bucs. So, I mean, the Chargers look like a good matchup for sacks right now. That no doubt helped Simmons, but his second game is going to be another good spot for that. We'll watch the playing time to see if it comes up, because if he stays around 30 to 40%, then that's not going to be somebody that we want to count on, even in a DT specific slot. But, again, we get a first round talent that delivers right away, then maybe we'll give him a look. And yeah, Thompson twins, it looks like they're splitting up because Deontay was the clear playing time leader. It's probably not going to matter that much this week against the Saints. Fortunately, we get one more week to see how much it matters. But then after that, they have, I want to say it's the Niners, Bucs, Niners. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3 straight games. And the Niners have been a positive matchup. So if Deontay Thompson's the guy, he could be useful for us in those 3 games.
I don't think we're going to see a trio of defensive tackles if they all pan out, like Oliver, Simmons, and Quinnen Williams ever again. I mean, Simmons was also a top 5, top 10 talent. Just felt because of the ACL. In my ever growing task, I want to save the Guru's pipes for all those matchups. So I'm going to go over your injury list and some of your notes, John, but please feel free before I toss it to you for the matchups to add anything else. Monte Nicholson playing Thursday night. No, not playing, probably because of an ankle, not practicing. Troy Apke, the workout wonder, might be out there as a pickup. Pernell McPhee has a triceps injury. We'll see what Baltimore does. They might be sniffing around for some edge players. Jalen Ferguson got the biggest increase in time. I still like my man, Tyus Bowser. I want to see him do some more, get some more snaps there. Deshaun Gibson went out. And by the way, I was able to beat John in that league because I did start Chase Edmonds, Arizona Cardinals social media account. Jaleel Adai getting in there for Deshaun Gibson. Leighton Vander Esch had a stinger issue. We'll watch that because he's had some neck issues in the past. Anthony Hitchens had a groin issue, didn't play in the second half. Ben Neiman would be a name to know there. CJ Mosley, Adam Gase said they're going to do a deep dive to figure out what his injury is. That doesn't sound good. Neville Hewitt also banged up. Blake Cashman, a rookie a lot of people liked, 90% of the snaps. Robert Quinn's on by with a rib issue. Damon Harrison Snacks went out with a groin issue, limited in his practice, and then Deshaun Hans also out. Watch out for John Atkins there. So Guru, feel free to add in anything if I draw attention to anything on the injury list. Give us those matchups for Week 8.
No, I think you did a pretty fine job of covering the injury things. One guy that I would kind of highlight a little bit is Troy Apke. It seems like whoever Washington plugs in at the safety position is going to have a multitude of opportunity, and he stepped in, played right around half of that game, or maybe a little more than that, and had a pretty nice stat line, 5 tackles, and I think he had a turnover and maybe an assist in there. So he looked pretty good. He's a former 4th-round pick, so it's not like the guy was just somebody they scraped up off the street. So he might be somebody that we wind up seeing for a few weeks, depending on how bad that ankle is for Nicholson. Some guys we want to get in our lineup this week, Justin Houston and Jabal Sheard versus Denver. These guys have combined for 15 tackles, 2 assists, 4.5 sacks, a forced fumble over the last 3 games. Meanwhile, Denver has allowed 19 sacks in their last 5 games, averaging almost 4 sacks a game allowed. Pretty good matchup. I've been particularly high on Justin Houston since he's kind of starting to get things rolling there in Indy. Gerald McCoy and Vernon Butler versus San Francisco. Even before they played in the monsoon last Sunday, San Francisco's offense was providing plenty of opportunity and solid production for opponents' interior linemen. These guys have been on a bit of a roll the last couple of weeks, so hopefully they'll continue that. Shaq Thompson versus San Francisco. It's another solid matchup. By this time, most everybody that has Shaq Thompson is plugging him in pretty much every week, but just in case you have a decision to make there, consider that 4 inside linebackers have racked up 7 or more solo stops against San Francisco, with a couple more getting to 5 solo tackles since week 3. Bernardrick McKinney or Zach Cunningham versus Oakland. And when you started off this season, you would have never thought that Oakland would wind up being a quality matchup for inside linebackers, but they absolutely have been. In week 3, we saw Eric Wilson go 7-4-2, Eric Kendrick 6-1 in that game. In week 4, it was Anthony Walker at 7-3-1. Bobby Okereke with 7 solo tackles. In week 5, it was Danny Trevathan with 11 solo tackles and Quan Smith with 9. Last week, Blake Martinez, 8 solos, 8 assists with a forced fumble, and even B.J. Goodson managed 5 solo tackles in that game. So if B.J. Goodson can put up 5 solo tackles, you need to start McKinney or Cunningham against them. Blake Cashman versus Jacksonville. Cashman's basically the last healthy man standing at the inside linebacker position for the Jets at this point. Not somebody that they were really looking to have be a starter when they headed into the season, but he's the best option they have. Played 90% of the snaps last week. Hewitt did practice on a limited basis today, so there is some chance that he can get back in the game, but even if he does, I think Cashman's going to get the lion's share of the opportunity there. Quan Alexander and Fred Warner versus Carolina. These guys, as good as the San Francisco defense has played, there hasn't been a lot of opportunity for tackles, especially at the linebacker and the safety positions. That front line is just tearing it up. Christian McCaffrey may be the best matchup in the game at this point for linebackers, especially when they're giving him 30 touches a game, and he's making the most of them. So those guys, Warner and Alexander, might be guys that you consider benching because neither one of them have put up more than, they've both reached double-digit fantasy points once so far this season, and it hasn't been since week 2 that either one of them has done that, but I would strongly consider starting them with this matchup. I like Darqueze Dennard this week against the Rams. Dennard is a solid tackle producer dating back to last season. He picked up right where he left off in week 7. It was his first playing time of the year. He played virtually full time, had 5 solo tackles, pair of pass breakups against Jacksonville. He's a guy that is going to be picked on a little bit, and with all the woes that they have there, he's going to be the number 1 defensive back, so he's likely going to end up on whoever they decide to designate as the best receiver out of that group. I don't know how you pick a number 1. They basically have 3 number 1s, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him have 5 or 6 solo tackles and maybe a pass breakup in this game. Like Darrell Worley versus Houston, with Conley moving on. Fuller's injured, so Worley is likely going to draw coverage on DeAndre Hopkins. Worley's one of those big physical type safeties. Would be a good matchup there if they decide to go that route. I don't really see any reason for them not to put their best defensive back on Hopkins and let them travel. Byron Murphy versus the Saints. Patrick Peterson's back, so opponents are going to be even more likely to go after the rookie as they're trying to avoid Peterson. We know that the Saints like to do that. We've seen that in the past, especially if they get Drew Brees back. Drew Brees kind of like is a magnet for rookies, and he will just absolutely try to terrorize those guys. Will Redmond versus the Chiefs. And this is a guy that's interesting because he's got a corner designation as a position in most league software, but he's actually been playing the safety position since Darnell Savage has been out. He had 9 tackles in week 5, 7 more against the Raiders in week 7. He had a 1 tackle game in between, which is a little reason for concern, but this is a strong matchup with the Chiefs. I think he would be a good sleeper to plug in there. And I like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson this week against Arizona. We pretty much already covered that. A couple guys that might get out of my lineup this week. Chandler Jones is a guy you pretty much have to start every week in many formats, but we should temper our expectations this week. The Saints are allowing less than 2 sacks per game since week 2 and have held 3 of their last 5 opponents to 1 or fewer. Budda Baker versus New Orleans. Opponent safeties have recorded more than 4 tackles against the Saints just once since week 2. Baker's somebody that everybody's been starting pretty consistently, but this week might be time to give him a rest. James Bradbury against San Francisco. The Niners have been a horrible matchup for corners simply because they're not throwing the ball very much. That might change now that they have a number 1 receiver in the building, but I really don't expect them unless they wind up behind in this game. I don't expect them to throw a whole lot. The cornerback position has combined for 21 solo tackles over the last 4 weeks or last 4 games against San Francisco. So Bradbury's not likely to get a whole lot of opportunity in this one.
we have a number one IDP team in the building. And of course, you got Matt Schauf, SCHAUFDS, and Draft Sharks. His work also top notch. I'm the lucky one who gets to absorb all these things as I record every Wednesday night. Thank you, everyone in the chat room. It's great to see the IDP diehards, people playing real fantasy football. Yeah, take your eye off the ball and enjoy defense and profit from it in your fantasy leagues. Profit from the knowledge of the guru and Matt Schauf as we steer this thing every Wednesday night live, and then you're getting it everywhere you get your podcasts with the Audible. Thank you, folks. It's a joy to provide this for you every week because you're so very classy. And then we count it down.